It is Friday, September 4th, Labor Day weekend, and who better than to talk to my next guest in particular? He is a professor. Um, he has written several books. I think several books that are very interesting on kind of just, I don't even want to call it capitalism because I think that's kind of selling it short, but a lot of things about the economy, markets, um, labor, you name it. He's a man of my heart right now. So he's a professor at currently was formerly at the University of South Carolina. You're at Cornell, correct, at this point?
At Cornell, yes. Yep.
All right. His name is Lawrence Glickman. He's written several books, some of which you may have heard me talk about, one of which is Free Enterprise, which came out last year. The other one is a living wage in America. Another one is The Cultural Turn, and also Buying Power. And so I got a chance to talk to Lawrence, and I'm really excited about this because we're going to talk about a lot of things that are actually present today, many of which are things that we haven't had a chance to really talk about in a while, and especially during Labor Day weekend, especially a Labor Day weekend of 2020, something that we reflect on a lot more, which is the market. What does it mean to have labor? What does it mean to have free markets and things like that? So I can't introduce him any better than he can introduce himself, so I'll let him introduce himself. Professor Lawrence Glickman.
Thanks so much, King. I really appreciate you having me on. I consider myself, I guess, an intellectual and cultural historian of capitalism, of the economy, and I'm particularly interested in the way that ordinary people make sense of economic things rather than elite economists and so forth. And I'm also super interested in the last 10 years or so in the history of conservatism. And finally, I've developed a new interest, mostly in my teaching and not yet in my research, in the history of sports and politics in America. Okay. And just yesterday, I had my first class of the semester at Cornell on sports and politics in American history. And the course is capped at 160 students, and I have a full class of 160 in that class. So there's a lot of interest in that topic among young people and probably among everyone these days.
Wow, you seem to be in the right place at the right time with a lot of your work. And so actually, before we get to that, like why in particular sports and politics? Yeah.
Well, there are a number of things that came together. One is that after the Great Recession of 2009, history enrollments around the country began to plummet. And so partly there was kind of a selfish reason for me, which is like, how can I teach a course that's sexy, that students will want to take, that has a topic that they're interested in, even if they don't necessarily think they gravitate towards history. So definitely part of it was that. But the other part is that I've always been interested in sports. And one of the things I like to do as a historian is to take topics like sporting events, sporting figures, and use them as a window to look at politics more broadly. And one of the things I'm finding is that students who might be reluctant to take a traditional history class just eat it up in this class. And we get deep into the weeds in history and methodology. And it's almost like they don't even know that it's happening, and they're sucked into thinking historically. So it's become one of my favorite courses to teach.
Okay. And I like that. I like that you actually mentioned about thinking historically, because I think one of the things I do a lot of in my writing or a lot of times my work is just bringing historical memory to things. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that you bring that to your work as well. And so with that said, I actually want to go into one of your books first, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Which is, you wrote something that was really interesting, which is, it's come up now because a lot of people question the nature of capitalism and the nature of the markets. And you wrote a book in particular entitled, actually two or I'm going to let you decide which ones those are. But one in particular was Free Enterprise in American History. And so I kind of want to start there for a second. Can you explain to people what that book was about and why is it so relevant today?
Sure. Essentially what it wound up being about was the conservative opposition to the New Deal of the 1930s and how the patterns that were set up then have continued to shape modern conservatism and so much of our political culture. And the reason I chose the term free enterprise is that's a term that we've all heard of, but nobody knows exactly what it means. It's quite a vague term. And that's one of the points of my book is that this is a term that really has no essential, fundamental meaning, but meanings were injected into it, and it became a kind of what I call an American common sense. And that's a really important term in my research, because I think what happens oftentimes in the United States is that when ideas are accepted as common sense, we don't interrogate them. We don't think about them. So what I began to do was say, what is this term that we all take for granted? How has it changed historically? When did it become popular, and why? And how have people used it politically over time? I still remember when I first started teaching at the University of South Carolina. It was a hot summer in the 1990s. I was moving into my office. I remember I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt because it was so hot outside. And a student walked into my office. This was like a week before classes started. I was unpacking books, and he came up to me. I was teaching a course on the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And he said, I'm thinking of taking your course. I really hope you're going to talk about the free enterprise system, because that's what made America great. And I remember thinking at the time, like, what does he think free enterprise is, and why is he saying that? And I made a mental note to myself that one day I was going to research that. It took me a while to get to it, but over the last 5 years or so, that's one of the things that I did.
Right. And I think that especially now, there's a certain circle of people online, in particular Twitter, who have really recently, and I'm talking within the last few months or so, really just started to get a lot of conversation about free enterprise, in terms of free enterprise will work itself out. Free enterprise will get all of America's situations under control if we just let the markets happen. A lot of this came in regards to just the bailouts as a whole. Some people felt like that was completely not the case, and some people thought that maybe the bailout system and the free market system didn't work at all. We maybe need to reconsider that. And I want to ask you about that. Based on all the knowledge that you know, do you have any comments to
that? Sure. I mean, I think, one of the things about American history is that through the 1930s, there were periodically major economic crises, not always at the level of the Great Depression, but very serious economic crises. And I think the idea generally was that the economy is a natural thing. We can't really do anything about it. We just have to suffer the pain. And then, ultimately after years of suffering, we'll emerge stronger. One of the innovations in the 1930s was that economists like John Maynard Keynes began to say, it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to suffer. There's nothing natural about the economy. The economy is what we make of it. It's how we construct it. What are our values? How do we want to treat people? How much do we want to pay people? These are not processes that are the result of some neutral market. There is no such thing as a neutral market. Markets are controlled. Markets are sites of power. And so this was one of the main motivations of the New Deal, was to say that we can shape an economy that works in our interests, and we don't have to suffer. We can do things to try to get out of depressions. We can do things so that workers who aren't earning living wages can have a better standard of living, and that's good for all of us. But that New Deal idea set off a counter reaction, which is mostly what my book is about. It's mostly about the way in which critics of the New Deal began to flock to the term free enterprise as a way of condemning what they saw as the dangerous tendencies of the New Deal.
And can you explain what some of those were? Because I think for a lot of people, this is the first time they've ever heard anything like this. This is probably like galaxy brain thinking for them right now. And the same thing wrong with that, but just the way we've been taught in class is none of what you're saying right now.
Right. And that's the power of common sense. And that's what I'm really interested in tracing historically, because I think it's often the things that, a lot of people don't question, that when you begin to question them, a new world opens up. And so, so just so many, my argument is that people who criticize the New Deal in the short run, they really failed, because the New Deal was very popular. What we call the New Deal order, which is the period that outlasted the New Deal, really until the 1960s or 70s. The ideas of the New Deal were dominant in America and very popular. But even at the very beginning in the 1930s, a minority, mostly of businessmen and some politicians, a lot of editorialists, and other conservatives began to challenge the New Deal and claim that it was a very dangerous trend. And although they lost in the short run, my argument is that over time, they built up a counter argument that more and more people were amenable to. And that ultimately, when kind of the 1970s, when the economy fell apart, a lot of people began to gravitate towards this idea that had been gestating for 40 years.
And I'm glad you said that, because especially now, if you go on Twitter, if you go on YouTube, there are a lot of people saying kind of what they're not saying it in the most eloquent way with the context that you have, but a lot of people are saying now when it comes to New Deal, well, maybe the New Deal wasn't a good thing and maybe we should have let the markets correct themselves. And I think people, your book does a good job of this. I think people don't understand how bad things had gotten in the economy at that point in time. I think we put our current day lens on previous problems. And I'm glad that a lot of your books are about that, which is like really contextualizing history and understanding it. And so that actually brings me to two of your other books. I think they kind of pair together, and maybe you don't. But one of which was they're both books on consumer. I don't want to say consumerism, because that's how I interpreted it. Mm-hmm. But they both are two books about consumer activism on one side, and then the other one is about really wages, but like from a consumer end. And so I want to start out first with Buying Power, if you don't mind. And so I think that it's a really great book. And I just want people to kind of understand what buying power is about and how that kind of relates to what we think about consumerism today.
Yeah, well, Buying Power was my book that was a history of consumer activism in America. A lot of people know about the Montgomery bus boycott. A lot of people know about the Boston Tea Party. And a lot of people maybe know about the United Farm Workers Grape Boycott of the 1960s and 70s. But what I wanted to show is that boycotting is really an American political tradition from the American Revolution through the present, and that a lot of Americans have expressed their political views through collective acts of consumption or collective withdrawal of consumption in the case of boycotts. And particularly for people who didn't necessarily have a lot of traditional political power, this has been a way, an avenue of politics. So what I wanted to do was to show, rather than studying this boycott or that boycott, was to say, this is actually a political tradition that's important. And a lot of times a lot of intellectuals especially demean consumption and sort of say it's not important. And I certainly, have my own critique of conspicuous consumption and waste and fraud and all of that. But I also think that, all Americans, very few of us grow our own food, make our own clothes anymore. All of us, to some extent, are consumers. And it's a site of power. Ordinary Americans have thought in really interesting and creative ways about this, but we really haven't taken it seriously.
Right. And the reason I bring that up also is because I think one of the things your book does a good job of is just essentially kind of getting us, like you mentioned it, to reframe what consumer, and this is not the word that you're using, but just this idea of how consumer choices really do affect society. And so I think that that's always something that's really interesting to me, is just how what we consider everyday things where people shop or where they do or don't spend money is actually a lot of times, sometimes a revolutionary act or like a very politicized one. And so that brings me to something else, which was a lot of things today in regards to the ongoing like resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement has been people who have said that they will not spend money in a certain organizations or certain places if they don't align with, more progressive views, I'll say it like that, in terms of like race relations, policing, and things like that. Do you think that this is in the tradition of the book that you've written, or is this something very different?
Oh, I think it's very much in that tradition. I mean, I think one of the things I wanted to show is that I don't think we can say a majority, but large numbers of Americans have always been concerned that the money they spend is in alignment with their values, in alignment with their ethics, and that doesn't contribute to immoral things. Now, of course, we all might define that differently. And that's one of the points of my book. I mean, one of the things I try to show in my book is that the boycott is not inherently progressive. People who are conservative also use boycotts. So it doesn't have a single political meaning, but I think it's significant that large numbers of Americans do care about the ethics of shopping, the ethics of spending money. And I think that's a really important tradition that is sometimes, again, I think, demeaned by intellectuals because they think consumption isn't really, is somewhat frivolous and not worth studying.
Okay, now why is that? Why do people consider that such a demeaning thing?
That's a great question. I've been working on that my whole academic career. A lot of it, I think, dates back to what was called the mass culture critique after World War II. I think a lot of intellectuals, sort of on the left and the right, converged on this idea that Americans were sort of shallow and materialist, and that consumption was not a serious thing. They ranked it below other activities, and they didn't necessarily see it as political at all. In fact, they often define consumption. I mean, that was almost equivalent with saying not interested in politics, apolitical, and so forth. I still find it today. I mean, people will say the most, they'll kind of just totally generalize about consumption. And I'll write sometimes on Twitter, I'll do this, and I'll say, would you ever say this about production? It's a complex thing. There's all different kinds of producers in the world. And would you generalize and kind of stereotype in that way? Because I get frustrated by that.
Yeah. And so I actually glad that you brought up Twitter because it seems to be you and a growing number of professors or academics or people who are just in the policy are more active online than they ever have been before, especially with people who are not in the university or in a governmental capacity. Do you think that a lot of the work that you've done and a lot of knowledge that you bring works well for a digital era where people want things that are very bite-sized or things that are kind of already in their purview?
It works really well for me, I think, for two reasons. One is that I love to share my historical research, and Twitter's a great venue because I can post a newspaper article and write a little comment or sometimes do a longer thread on it. And the other thing is that I've always been someone, ever since I was a teenager, who read the newspaper and had a certain criticism of the way the media reported on things. And, it used to be that I would just curse or spit into my coffee or say something to a family member or something like that. And now I feel like I've got a bit of a megaphone where I can say, I don't really like the way the Washington Post is reporting this story. Here's how I think they're not framing it correctly. And so for me, it's good therapy because rather than just being angry, I can actually say something. And, a lot of times, there's not much of a response to it, but other times on Twitter, it's pretty gratifying because a lot of people will respond to it. Sometimes challenge me, which is fine. And so I like that about Twitter. I like the fact that you can talk back and allow those critical points of view to be aired in some fashion.
Okay, I like that. And so one of the things you also mentioned is the news. And one of the things you've done this year in 2020, you've managed to do something a lot of people wish they could do, which is have two pieces published in The Atlantic. And so one of which I'm really interested in, which is you wrote, this was, I believe, May of this year. You wrote a piece about how essentially like white, I don't want to say like anti-progress, but like there was a certain level of backlash, which didn't allow for progress. Can you kind of explain to people what that was?
Sure. Yeah. By the way, I was absolutely thrilled to publish in The Atlantic. It's always been a dream of mine. And if you had told me at the beginning of 2020 that I would publish two pieces in there, I wouldn't have believed you. So that was really exciting. But the piece on the backlash is part of a book that I'm writing now. And what I was trying to show in that piece, a couple of things. One is that I think we really need to understand the phenomenon of backlashes as a very, very powerful force in American history. Kind of like boycotts, backlashes have been studied or understood as discrete things. So you've got a backlash against this, a backlash against Reconstruction, say, a backlash against the Civil Rights Movement, a backlash against the New Deal, a backlash against the women's movement, a backlash against the gay rights movement. And what I wanted to do in that article, and what I hope to do in the book, is to say, backlash is not a periodic force. It's a pretty constant force in American life. We need to understand it better because it's very, very powerful. So that was one of the things I wanted to do, was to highlight that. And the other thing I wanted to do was just show, I'm totally interested in the origin of terms and how they develop. And so backlash had a very different meaning until 1963, when it became part of this idea of the white backlash against the civil rights movement.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that people are slowly starting to wake up to that. And so it's something that I've said a lot on Twitter, which is, and it's going to ruffle probably a few of my listeners' ears, which is, and that's why I'm glad you wrote that, which is a lot of people kind of assume that the way I was taught, and then I know people younger than me as well, the civil rights movement was essentially like the end of racism. Martin Luther King won, rainbows happened, and then there was nothing, right? So like and then all of a sudden, Barack Obama gets elected. It seems to like the way we're taught in school was very...
Yeah, a triumphalist narrative, yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm glad you wrote that, and it's something that I've learned, in my undergraduate time at Georgia State, and then just doing more research in the journalism world. But I'm glad you brought that up, because I think people don't understand how historic backlash has shaped our current American politics. And so that's why I really wanted to talk to you about that as well.
Yeah. Another thing that I thought was interesting that I discovered in researching this, that again, I think the normal way we think about backlashes is that you have a social movement for equality, and that's fine. Of course, at the time, no one thinks that, but looking back, people say, everyone supported the civil rights movement when Martin was in charge of it. We know that's not true at all, but that's the mythology that develops, but then it went too far, and that's when you get the backlash. So after Black Power, say 1966 or so, then the backlash emerges, or after the urban riots from 65 through 68. But one of the things that I wanted to show is that the backlash happened well before that. In fact, the amazing thing is that the term white backlash is coined a full year before the Civil Rights Act passes in 1964. So the term that I use is that backlashes are preemptive. That is, they are not a reaction to the excesses of a movement. They are often meant to cut off that movement before it even achieves its initial goals. So that's something that I found, again, pretty consistently. You find a very similar pattern in the Reconstruction era, and that's one of the things that I think that people who study African American history more than I do are like totally familiar with this pattern. But the idea that half measures being people getting impatient with them very quickly and saying, "Oh, we tried that, it failed, let's move on." You saw that happen in Reconstruction. You saw it happen in civil rights, and I think in many other cases as well. So I'm very interested in that phenomenon, which I think I'm just writing a grant proposal now for my book on backlashes. And one of the things that I'm trying to show is that this model of the movement's gone too far, and that's when the backlash happens, is just historically not accurate.
I like that, because I think that one of the things that people are starting to see now, and in particular myself, is you start to see like different pockets of backlash, the current Black Lives Matter movement, and there's a lot to unpack with that. So I know this is not the episode for that, but one of which is now, because in some cases there are people who are committing like violence against property or sometimes violence against each other. People have now started to use that as a quick out to say, hey, I don't support the movement now, or like to completely expend the narrative. And so from the things that you've written, it seems like this is kind of both historical, but also like a new bend to that like historical lens, because it's happening so fast with so much other layers to it.
I think that's exactly right. The key is so fast. I mean, I think what we're seeing just in 2020, it seems, is an acceleration of history. You know, to take another example of that sort, the you know, it took in the Great Depression, it took basically 4 years to reach maximum unemployment of about 15 million people. And here, you know, basically between March and June, we did that. And then we've got, you know, now we went well below that, but there are still, you know, I forget the number, but something like 25 million Americans filing jobless claims now. So everything is being telescoped so fast, and it makes us hard to react, because during the Great Depression, there were 4 years, there wasn't social media. You know, I think things developed a little more slowly, whereas now there's kind of instant transformations and very quick reactions. And sometimes it's hard to get our bearings in these situations.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's one of the reasons why now not only the backlash is growing, but also this growing movement of people who want to go back and learn from history. Because I've had so many people in the last 3 or 4 months just reach out to me like, hey, I know you do a lot of work, because my normal work is in gentrification and urbanism, but like, hey, can you help explain to me how we got here in the first place? And so I don't know if you've seen that yet, but I've seen
very much, yeah,
people trying to go backwards to understand the present.
Yeah, one of the things that I mentioned that, you know, after the crash of 2009, there was a real decline in the number of history majors. And I think that hasn't fully recovered. But I think definitely here at Cornell, and from what colleagues elsewhere tell me, there's an increase in enrollment in history courses, even if there aren't necessarily more history majors. But I think a lot of younger people are trying to look to history to explain how we got here, because the last 4 years have been like one whiplash after another. And the last 6 months certainly have been that. And so I think history is a great resource that more and more people are turning to try to make sense of the present.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I think that right now has been really fascinating, is that so many people of all types are like really trying to understand America's history, because what it's presented as and what it actually is are two quite different things. And so that brings me to something else, which is you've written about, and it was actually the first thing you actually wrote in The Atlantic. And I think that was also something that was really interesting to me, because it's called, correct me if I'm wrong, the Conservative Campaign Against Safety.
Yes.
And so can you explain to people what that was? Because I think that was also, in the context of everything that's going on in the country right now, that's a really good primer to kind of understand things.
Yeah, well, one of the things that when, you know, there began to be this conservative reaction to things like mask wearing and social distancing, and you know, a lot of people were shocked by it, because like in other countries around the world, there wasn't, you know, the conservative parties of Europe didn't have this reaction and say, you know, I'm not going to believe in science, I'm not going to do this. But there was a way in which so much of the language was about risk-taking is very American. And safety and security are dangerous forces. They'll make us weak. They'll make us, oftentimes it's a very gendered language of unmanly and so forth. And of course, Trump very much uses that sort of language. Just yesterday, he criticized Biden for loving his mask so much, and I think suggesting there was something not masculine about that. And the interesting thing for me was, the reason I wrote that piece for The Atlantic is this was exactly the rhetoric that was used against the New Deal. A lot of critics of the New Deal were saying, you know, this is going to make us a less manly society. Too much security, being spoon-fed is not good for, you know, we're a risk-taking people. And so the critique of the New Deal wasn't necessarily about this program or that program. It was that the New Deal is instilling an ethic that is dangerous. It's an ethic of security, and it's sort of a feminizing ethic, and it's an un-American ethic. And I just thought the parallels were really astonishing.
And I want to take a little bit of a segue, because this actually reminds me of another text that you wrote called The Cultural Turn. And so while these don't seem like they are related, a lot of things that you're saying right now is kind of reflecting in your book. And this is, what, 8 or 9 years ago? at this
Yeah.
point.
I
And
think
so
10 maybe.
yeah, and so you talk about in that book about the cultural term, and a lot of it, the way I interpret it was a lot of like subgroups or subcategories of Americans, like whether you are Black or LGBT or people from the disability community, gaining more prominence in places and just more notoriety causes a shift as well. And maybe I interpret that wrong, but
No, I think you're right.
Okay.
I think historically what happened was that in the 1960s, 1970s, there arose a new mode of doing history called the new social history. And this idea was that we need to bring in the people who've been left out of history. So I remember my first semester at college, I took a course called American Social History, and it totally blew my mind because I had, studied sort of the traditional political presidential history in high school. In my textbook, if it mentioned slavery, it was hardly at all. Maybe Susan B. Anthony was mentioned, but hardly any women's history and so forth. And this course was like all about the people who were left out of my traditional history books, and it totally blew me away. Like I was like, wow. There's a history of enslaved people. There's there's women's history. There's a history of working people, and so forth. So that, I think, in the 60s and 70s, then morphed in the 80s and 90s into this cultural history. And I think that what began to happen in cultural history was it wasn't just that these people appeared in history, but we need to take their ideas seriously and study them as an intellectual historian would study a philosopher or a president. We need to understand, the way that enslaved people thought. For example, my advisor, the late Lawrence Glickman, wrote a book that really had a strong influence on me. It came out, when I was still a kid, but it affected me in grad school, and it was called Black Culture and Black Consciousness: African American Folk Thought from Slavery to Freedom. And it came out in like 78 or 79. But what Levine did in that book was he said, this is not a history of thought, it's a history of people thinking. And what he meant by that is that this isn't, the canonical thinkers who write philosophy books. This is ordinary people emerging from slavery to freedom. How are they thinking about the world? How are they understanding the world? What stories are they telling? What frameworks are they using? And he used in that book a lot of folklore, which was very innovative at the time, a lot of anthropological evidence and that sort of thing. And what I loved about that book was he took his subjects, in this case, African-American enslaved people and then freed people. He took them, just extremely seriously as sources of intellectual history. And to me, that's a lot of what the cultural turn is to take the methods of intellectual history, but to apply them to people that oftentimes traditional intellectual history, at least in the past, wasn't that interested in. I should say that intellectual history has really changed nowadays. So there's tons of intellectual history work on these topics. In fact, probably one of my favorite blogs is the African American Intellectual History blog, which is one of the most vibrant places on the internet, where every single day there's book reviews and interviews and articles. And so, no one would think what I thought when I started college in the 80s, that there isn't really a history of, African-American intellectual thought beyond the great thinkers like Frederick Douglass or something.
Right. And so I actually want to ask about that in particular, which is, there's the obvious answer, but then there's a secondary answer. And so why do you think that so many people, when they get to college, like yourself, myself in particular, we are exposed to basically like an explosion of like thought and history? Why do you think that is? It takes the collegiate level to get that kind of exploration or exposure to knowledge.
Yeah. My sense is it's a bit varied. I'm finding more and more students coming in my freshman classes, and they're like, yeah, I know I studied,
Oh, wow.
social history in high school, but it's definitely not universal. I think, my own view, which is not, I haven't researched it, so I can't say for sure, but I do think that there's a real problem with teaching to the test and standardized testing. I know watching my kids go through the school system, everything was about organizing a curriculum around what was the George Bush thing called? I can't remember.
No Child Left Behind. I
Yeah,
remember that.
right.
Yeah.
So I think that, my kids had wonderful history teachers in high school growing up, but I think they were somewhat constrained by those things, and even so, they managed. My kids were able to learn a lot of these things that I didn't learn in high school. But I think that is one of the problems we face, is that if you have a standardized curriculum that has to be mastered by May or April when the test is taken, it can limit what we do. Now, it is true that more and more of the things that weren't on my high school curriculum are part of what needs to be mastered. But I don't think there's not as much opportunity to study these things in an organic and creative way as there is in college courses, I would say.
Right. And so I'm glad I think that we both are seeing that the educational spectrum of what history is and just like deep thought is really changing rapidly. And so that actually brings me up to something else, which is you're a professor, you had a very good university, and no one lives under a rock, but it is a very different educational experience right now than it has been for a long time. And so I want to ask you, has that affected your teaching in any particular way, just with the pandemic and how classes are supposed to be going about this year?
100%. Last spring I was teaching, of course, the semester began in a traditional way. I was teaching, co-teaching a course with my colleague Ed Baptist in the history of capitalism, and I was teaching a seminar on called From the New Deal to the Age of Reagan. And of course, like every place else in the middle of the semester, they sent the students home and we had to start teaching online. And this semester, I'm teaching this sports history course, as well as I'm also teaching that New Deal to the Age of Reagan seminar. But now, from the very beginning, I'm teaching them only in an online format. And it is very, very different. I think it's really, really hard for the students. It's hard, certainly, for me as a faculty member to adjust. I think I'm really so pleased that the Cornell students at least are cutting people like me a lot of slack, because I'm no expert on technology. And sometimes, I try to share the screen with a document and it doesn't work and I have to come back to it later. So everyone's being kind to each other at my university, but I know there's enormous stress on students. In fact, in my first class yesterday, I talked about this. I'm very concerned about the levels of depression I'm reading about young people. I don't know if you saw, King, the statistic on the number of young people who thought about suicide.
No.
But it was very, very high. I can't remember the number now, but more than 10%, I think. Okay. And so, it's really, really hard to, on the one hand, I want to give my students the best that I can give them and teach them history. But as you're saying, we're not living in a bubble. I mean, many of these people are dealing with sick family members. Some of them are, in economically precarious situations, and almost everybody is dealing, has a lot more on their plate than they usually do. So, I'm just, like everyone else, trying to muddle through, but it is very, very difficult and very, very different. And it's so hard I'm the kind of teacher that I just live on feedback and energy in the room. And I try to mimic that when I'm teaching using Zoom, but it's really, really hard. It's not the same. And so I do all these sort of things to try to create that environment.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think that this is going to be a real challenge for everyone going forward. And I think that for you all and what you're trying to do and what all the other universities and K through 12 schools are trying to figure out is still ongoing. This gets me to something I do want to ask you, which is somebody who's a long professor, a very experienced professor, and now moving into this space. What is something that you wish that you could do better with the Zoom experience that you normally would do great in the classroom?
Well, I think it's harder to convey empathy for students. I think it's harder to convey my enthusiasm. I'm sitting here with headphones, whereas in a classroom, I mean, I usually get so stoked that one time in South Carolina, I was so excited that I actually walked and fell off the stage.
Oh
I was
wow.
like,
Okay.
I was just thinking about everything that was going on. I was so animated. I was fine, but I joked because it was actually a class on labor history. And I said, we haven't yet gotten to the point about industrial accidents, but I was just demonstrating that for you. That's hard. It's also really hard to read students. You know, I think if
Yeah.
I'm teaching a class, especially a smaller class, you know, you could see students' eyes glazing over. Maybe I'm using a term they don't understand. And it's harder on Zoom to notice those things sometimes. And so, you know, just kind of the kind of way in which we all adapt to the chemistry of being in a room with other people is just really not there on Zoom.
Okay. And so now I want to ask you, which is, this is a question I'm gonna re-tailor it because I asked everyone really two outgoing questions, but for you, this is going to be a different version of that. The first version of the question is this, and this is how we're going to re-tailor it, which is normally I would ask people, what is something about you or your work or your profession that people misconstrue that you want to change, you know, or like, you know, have the opportunity to correct people on. And so we're going to do that. But then I want to ask about your book. So we're going to go through the line of those books. So first, about you as a historian or you as a professor, what is something about your career that people misconstrue that you want to change up?
Well, a couple of things about being a professor. One is that I've been lucky in my career, for me, because I love to research and write, but I've taught at research universities. And sometimes I hear people say that, you know, the professors don't care about teaching. You know, they don't really care about the students. And I've taught, you know, in two excellent history departments, and I've never had a colleague who didn't take teaching extremely seriously, didn't care deeply about their students. And so that's one thing that I think is often misconstrued, that professors, you know, are only interested in their own research. That couldn't be farther from the truth. I think for most of us, and certainly for me, you know, my research feeds on my teaching. Like, I love it when my students read documents that I'm working on and researching, and a lot of times they have an interpretation of it that I haven't thought of. So that's, I think that's one really important lesson that I wanted to give. And the other one is that, you know, there's a lot of talk these days about political correctness and that sort of thing. And I think for me, you know, I'm definitely on the progressive side of the political spectrum, but I would never think about penalizing a student who didn't agree with me. I've been lucky. I've had students with all different political views. And I love that, and I welcome that. And, you know, the last thing I want to do is indoctrinate my students. That is not interesting to me. I'd much rather have a student write an interesting paper, even though I might disagree with it. But if they, you know, if they write a good paper that's well documented, they're going to get a good grade on the paper. Whereas someone might think they're saying everything I want to hear, but if it's a crappy paper, they're going to get a crappy grade. So those are two things that I think I hear a lot that are just not, from my experience, true.
Okay, I like that. And so now I want to ask, what is something about each one of your books that people misconstrue that you want to correct?
Well, my first book was this idea on the idea of the living wage, how American workers developed that idea. And my second book was this buying power book on consumer activism. I'll pair those together because, again, I think I mentioned this a little bit before, but I think a lot of times people have very reductionist or simplistic ideas about consumption. And one of the things I wanted to show is that in both of those books, that you know, consumption can be part of a radical critique of capitalism. It doesn't have to be that, but it can be. And that American workers who rethought what a wage was and began to talk about this idea of a living wage and what workers were entitled to by virtue of being human beings, I think was a really monumental thing that we often today kind of dismiss and don't take seriously. So I think those are those two books are really important things that I wanted to convey. That consumption is as important, as complicated politically as any other political category you could think of. So don't reduce it, don't simplify it. And
Okay.
I would just say about my free enterprise book, for me, the key is that think about the things that are common sense that that we all know, but we don't really interrogate. And so I think that that's a really important thing that historians can do is what is it that we take for granted and why? And let's let's uncover that and think about why.
Okay. And so uh, the last question I ask everyone, I'm going to ask you right now, which is, what's making you happy?
Well, seeing students again yesterday after not seeing them all summer made me very happy because even though I'm very stressed about teaching them, I also just love to see them, love to see their faces. Yesterday in my sports and politics class, we kind of began by just thinking about what are some recent intersections of sports and politics. And I literally had to stop after 20 minutes because the students had so much to say about it. So I just love that enthusiasm that they bring. It gives me life. It gives me hope. It's wonderful. And I've been a runner for a long time. And one of the things that is also making me sane is being able to leave, because I'm mostly working in my home, like a lot of other people who are lucky enough not to have to leave their house and have a job. But one of the frustrating things about it is it can be claustrophobic. So getting out and running is something that makes me extremely happy.
Okay. And if people want to buy any of one of your books, they want to follow you on Twitter, how can they do that?
Well, my Twitter handle is Larry Glickman, and my all my books are available at any of your local bookstores or online booksellers. And I usually write under the name Lawrence B. Glickman, even though all my friends call me Larry, but I use that formal name for my writing so people can find me either of those ways.
Okay. And thank you again for taking out the time to talk to me today. I know we had to go through a lot of different things really fast, and I'm really glad you gave me the time to do that. And so if you all haven't already, please check out Professor Glickman's work. I will put a link to the show notes for all of your books and also for his 2-piece in The Atlantic, as well as his Twitter account. But I cannot stress this enough. It's a really great read. It's really great just Twitter follows and just different things related to history. And if you haven't done already, please make sure you follow him and pick up and purchase one of his books. Before we get out of here, I want to let everyone know this is the Neighborhood Watch podcast, and I really thank you all for listening and tuning in. I do have a newsletter of my own. If you haven't already, it is the intersection of Atlanta and everything. So it's called I Am King Williams. So I Am King Williams.substack, SUBSTACK. So again, I Am King Williams.substack.com. Today's newsletter is going to feature our interview today, but it's also going to feature some things I've been working on now, which is the big business of podcasts. If you guys haven't read already, there is Donald Albright, who is the producer of the Atlanta Monster podcast about the Atlanta child murders. And so you're going to see a little bit of mentioning of that, as well as like what the big business is on the podcast and in the marketplace. So once again, you all, please make sure you subscribe to my newsletter, IamKingWilliams.substack.com. Thank you once again for Professor Glickman tuning in, and I hope to hear from you all next week.